Now I will request to Bodhi sir. So I'll just give a small kind of, not like a kind of summary, but the point that everybody has made, and then I'll request her to. So I think there's a few very, very interesting points that has emerged in our discussion. So one is about the evolution of, like as Dr. Azada has talked about how the evolution of the tribal community has been in the society has been happening, and she was trying to say like in a caste reality or in a caste society, evolution has happening. And second is like a mostly like Vishal and everybody is talking about the pragmatism. So they are connecting with the philosophy, the pragmatism also from the Karl Popper, and also the pragmatism how the Baba Sahib has how to locate the pragmatism within the Navyana. So that's another I feel is a kind of that coming we can reflect together. And some of us also talking about this the conflict of interest and conflict of values, and then I'll come to like what Salisa and also Vishal together was talking about the subjectivity and also about the context, how the context is being like very very significant, as Vishal has given I think multiple examples, all those the work that has been done. I think Akshay was also talking that how he was talking about how to write the biography, what kind of content is needed. So I was just trying to connect that that is also related to somewhere like a kind of subjectivity and also the context. And and then Salisar also has talked about the knowledge actually, how the knowledge is significant, what the significance of the context, what the significance of the the knowledge or the subject actually it has been there. It should not be just kind of the process of I think writing and process of just producing some content. So this is my small I think what would I make sense as I wanted to put in front of Bodhi sir. So reflect on these kind of the pragmatism, the context, the subjectivity, the conflict of interest and conflict of evaluation, and also if you can reflect on how to when one is writing the biography, so what are the component, what kind of things as one has to have in the process of writing, and also the in the context of that the knowledge and the framework. So I think there are so many things I just wanted to bring in a small way, so that can reflect. So now I invite Bodisa to if you can come and give some your reflection on that.
Today is difficult to reflect. Too many things. I was just thinking, sitting down, thinking, writing some points, and I was thinking a lot of issues. So it's a little bit difficult, I think, to kind of look in totality. Probably one more round we can have, and then I'm also thinking what to. So there are certain issues which I'm not very clear myself. I need to do some reading in order to kind of share my reflections. So some more pinpointed concepts, Dinesh. Like in totality, it's becoming very difficult. So if you can pick up some point and then we can all then reflect together, I can also throw my reflections.
Yeah. So in that matter, I think I would like to like what I am trying to understand also like everybody is talking. The context I think is finding very very significant. Like in the matter of writings, like ongoing or present writings, the people are like writing in all over the world and focusing on specifically Baba Sahib. I think the context is one of the significant that is missing. Either they are writing on the biographies or they are writing on the pragmatism, or people are translating the work. I think the context is missing. That is one. I think if you can reflect. And second, the subjectivity. I think that is very very as Salisa has mentioned, the subjectivity. I think very very significant. We spoke last time some of the things, and I think when we take subjectivity, another concept, I think if you can reflect, that also like a cover part of methodology and also the questions that has emerged from some of the Sangha members. So I think this is the two I can say in a like basically three major concepts or maybe yeah. So what I can say the pragmatism and the context and third is what we can say about the writings actually the how the knowledge is has been in matter of subjectivity. So these are things I think I can a small I can say in a small like way if you can reflect on that. So and other I think we can later also together reflect. So I hope that will be make sense. Yeah.
Uh, Now we have reached a very different level of thinking. So probably it requires a little bit of reading in order to be able to kind of provide a more precise uh, reflection about the subject. Probably the the point about contextualization is something that we can just think about, because contextualization, the way we spoke about it, is more methodological. We're speaking more in the methodological sense. We're not speaking about context as an idea or even context as a theory in that sense, but we are speaking about context much more in the methodological sense. Now, the question that was raised that day about context is that there's some noise somewhere. The thing that we were speaking about context that day was that one of the mistakes that, at least from our point of view, I don't think it is the fault of the author if they do not consider context as fundamental to the process of theorizing. Like this authors that we have been speaking about, some of the people writing about Baba Sahib at this point in time. And the argument that we kind of posited was that many of these thinkers, many of these authors writing about Baba Sahib, they come from a very universalist point of view. In that point of view, context is not important at all. Context is not even to be considered a critical issue that needs to be embedded in the analysis of social reality, even if that social reality is a very complex reality the way we experience in this country. And in that complexity, we have Baba Sahib who had to operate within this complex reality. So one can only say this much, that whatever reality they look at is such a complex reality that any attempt to simplify that reality by chronologizing, by creating a chronology of events, or by trying to interpret this chronology of events in a manner that does not consider the context within the so-called framework of analysis, from our point of view, it is definitely problematic. Now, one thing about the universalist or the universal point of view is that it tends to think of itself as objective. Its claim to objectivity is very high. And not only it claims objective, it claims to be non-bias. It is non-bias. And this non-bias is because it's not located anywhere. It speaks about the reality, totally detached from that reality, not connected to that reality, not identified with that reality. That's why it is non-bias. And its ability to look at that reality claim from a location of objectivity allows them to generalize whatever they write. So this notion of objectivity and this notion of being non-biased is a long debate in the history of methodology. Even in philosophy, it's a big debate. But what is unfortunate is that it has been hidden under something called colonialism to such an extent that people don't even think that it is a matter of debate. They have accepted it. And the best place to observe the total acceptance of such a particular process is the university system. The universities are built on the idea of the production of knowledge that is objective and non-biased, and the usage of methods and methodology that basically makes similar arguments of that kind. Now, many of us who come from the realities that we come from are always out of place in this kind of a framework. We will never be at ease. Now, in the beginning, I used to think, why am I not at ease? When everybody is so at ease, why am I having a problem? And I used to think, actually, the problem is with me, not with the structure of the framework in which these kind of debates are taking place. But the deeper I look, I began to realize that one of the reasons that I'm uneasy with this framework is simply because this framework generally is a framework of the dominant. In the world of methodology, only the dominant is objective. Only the dominant is unbiased. Only the dominant has no location. Only the dominant does not identify. They engage simply in knowledge. But anybody who says, I am a tribe, I am a Dalit, I am a this, I am a that, then immediately you are located, and that location throws out a biased analysis of reality, a very subjective analysis of reality that doesn't consider objectivity at all, and so on and so forth. Now, when one begins to look at this structure, then one realizes that it's a structure of power. It's a political structure. Why is it that the dominant can claim objectivity? Why is it that the dominant can claim to be non-biased, while all the oppressed people are always subjective, always biased about what they say, and they can never even articulate anything in the realms of objectivity? Why is that so? So this question is a big question that we have to ask properly. The reason, at least to me, I think is multiple, but I don't have the time to get into each of these reasons. The one reason that I have found out personally is because one of the best ways, the most strategic way to control anything, especially in the domain of knowledge, if you want to control knowledge, if you want to control the kind of knowledge that is produced, if you want to control the knowledge that probably can be emancipatory, different, liberatory, freedom providing, if you want to create a knowledge of that kind, if you don't want to allow the production of such kind of knowledges, then the best place to control is methodology. If you can control methodology, you can control the knowledge and claim that either that knowledge is valid or invalid. Either that knowledge is useful or not useful. Either that knowledge is great knowledge or is a pathetic knowledge in that particular sense. So knowledge is given a label in the realms of the useful and the unuseful, in the realms of the valid and the non-valid, simply because someone can control this thing called methodology. Now, it is not hard to realize that people who are invested in methodology, as I used to say, if you look at the dominant and the way they control methodology, it's very interesting. India is a very interesting case right now. And it's interesting because the dominated, the excluded, the oppressed people are challenging this particular domain of methodology like never before. For a long time, it was a debate about theory. Now the debate has become about methodology. And because the debate has become about methodology, the dominant don't know what to do because they don't have an answer to this debate. Because it is a power, it's a political project. It's not a project of methodological truth seeking. So if it's a political project, then the only thing that I know as a tool of dominance is to control and use power to control you, use power to shut you down, use power to say that what you are doing is right or wrong, use power. So using power in order to be able to control the knowledge framework is a totally different kind of a game altogether. So once you use power, then the powerless also knows that this is an act of power. This is not an act of truth seeking at all. So we also know that if you tell us this is the only correct method, this is the only correct methodology, you are wrong if you do that. If you are wrong if you do this, you'd be amazed to know that anyone who looks a little bit deeper will realize that this is a political project. For example, one very interesting example is that if you go to some universities that works on technology, like the IITs and some of these universities, they are very, very strict about their methodology and the method. Okay, strict observation, strict theoretical reasoning, because that particular domain of work allows that kind of a methodological process. But you should ask yourself a question, and I have been asking this question across universities because when I visit these universities, I used to ask them what kind of methodology or what kind of method would you use in your PhD research. You'll be amazed to know that many of them use ethnography. Many ethnography. I used to think in the beginning, what is this ethnography? I used to think. Now, if you look deeper and use this as a data in order for us to be able to analyze these processes properly, we'll begin to realize that one of the reasons we use ethnography is just we are not clear what methodology we are using. However, ethnography allows us to do the things we want to do and hide us around the idea of scientificity, around the idea of a valid methodology, while actually we are doing what we want to do. So if you ask many of the people in the social science what method they are using, it depends on how you look at ethnography, but what methodology, what method you're using in your research, they will all say ethnography. There will be some people who work in the health areas and the domain of health, or some in the area of education. They will say we are using a quantitative framework, but many will talk about qualitative frameworks, about ethnography, about some of these kind of very different approaches to research. There's a reason there. The reason is not simply because I understand ethnography. The reason is because ethnography, under the garb of scientificity, allows me to do what I want to do and pursue the knowledge I want to pursue. This is where the real crux of the issue is. Now, there are many reasons for this, but we can get into that reason a little bit later. Now, the question is that everybody is kind of pitching is to understand why is it that we are saying that there is one thing that has happened in many of these writers, these contemporary writers, and contemporary means really contemporary, which means just 4, 5 years, 6, 7 years back. Why is it that many of these people are writing about Baba Saheb Ambedkar? Now that we have discussed that, because this is a trend, as Shailesh also said, this is a trend across the world. People are the mainstream, the dominant mainstream has saturated in terms of knowledge, and they're seeking new knowledges from the margins. So this margin thinking has become a very popular idea. Okay, otherwise the mainstream thinkers don't have anything new to speak about. And worst part is not that. The worst part is that neither they have anything to speak about, yet not have the capacity to actually learn from the margins. They are still in the process of teaching the margins. So the margin is the theorist. The mainstream center is the theorist. The margin is the empirical data. So Gopal Guru is right. And the way we have conceived it, the theoretical west and the empirical rest. So they are not willing to let go of their theory. They hold firm to their theory, but they are looking for new data that will prove their theory differently, that will produce new dimensions to their theory. So this is a very complex process in the debates in academic right now. Now, the biggest problem here I see is that many of us also are trapped in this debate. Actually, the university system and many of these so-called knowledge frameworks demand us to use the theory of the West in order to analyze our own empirical reality, which is part of the rest. You know, so if you're coming to university, you are forced to learn Western theory, which means the theoretical West, because they are the one who produce our theory about the world, nah? And their theory is universal, while we are the data. So we are looking at us, and this complexity has provided a situation in which many people are confused what we are doing. Yep, all of us are confused what we are doing, especially in the domain of knowledge and knowledge production. So now the question that we have to ask is, and the question that we are asking now, that probably will not occur to the dominant mainstream, is what is lacking in the theorization process? What is this? Not only the ability to learn from the other, okay, the mainstream has lost the capacity to learn. They only know how to teach. So when they write a book, they're only writing a book from the perspective of teaching. They're not writing the book from the perspective of learning. This to me is the biggest problem. Anybody who locates oneself within that framework, like Vishal correctly said, some of the thinkers who have written about some of the books that he has raised at this point in time are speaking from the location and the position of an objective teacher, a non-biased teacher. And an objective, non-biased teacher, there is a word for that. It's called arrogance. It's called a methodological arrogance, an intellectual arrogance that generally stems from. And where does that arrogance come from? I am so objective. I am so non-biased. I'm doing such great work. I'm teaching these people what is really the reality all about. I'm giving the correct interpretation of that reality. They don't even know what it is all about. So that location is, this location is generally called the imperial eye, the eye that is the colonial eye, the imperial eye, the eye that can only teach, not the eye that can learn. Now, if you listen to me speak like this, the first thing that will naturally come to your mind is that, who are we then? Are we, on the other hand, non-imperial in the way we look at reality? And in that sense, our capacity to learn is fundamental rather than the capacity to teach. Now, is learning any problem with that learning? Does becoming a learner for the whole life, for instance, this allows you to obtain or attain some kind of a power that will allow you to speak from the imperial eye location? Now, this is again another methodological question. Now, if you look at our reality, many of us are learners. We don't imagine ourselves as teachers. If you look at our own Sangha, many of us are learners. We are not teachers. We don't come and teach anything. We come and reflect. There is a dialogue happening here. There is no one lecturing to anybody. And in this dialogue, we are always open to new ways of looking, new ways of learning, new ways of understanding, new ways of interpreting. We are looking at new realities, accommodating new realities, constantly changing and learning and learning and learning and so on and so forth. Now, the characteristics of a learner is that they don't generally claim that they know. They don't generally claim that, their writings are, for instance, objective and so objective that it can be generalized across time, place, space, and person. The knowledge we produce is universal. It applies to everybody across time and place. We don't generally are like that. Now, one can go a little bit deeper into this, the characteristics of a learner and the characteristics of a teacher. Okay, we belong to that particular school, constantly learning something new, accommodating. And the learner is generally not egoistic. The learner is more humble. The learner is there's high degree of humility in a learner. If you can see the characteristics of people who are learners, you will see this. And I will tell you, at least in my experience, one of the best examples that we have of a learner is Baba Saheb Ambedkar himself. He was a learner till he died, constantly learning. Okay, stating clearly where the boundaries are, stating clearly what can be known, stating clearly what cannot be known, but constantly learning and learning from anybody. He learned from his own person working with him. He learned from his helper. He learned from John Dewey. He learned from his own people. He learned from the debate in Burma. He learned from Tamil Nadu. He learned from everywhere. Always, constantly willing to learn. And that's why that knowledge that Baba Sahib produced is dynamic. Look at the knowledge he produced. It's a very dynamic knowledge. It's like a gel. It can turn and it can shape itself and adapt itself to realities differently. Because he did not make universal claims. It is like this only, and this is the only way to interpret, and this is the only way to see, and this is the only way to analyze. No, that kind of knowledge was not there. The Buddha and his Dhamma is it's such a flexible text. You can work with it. You can embody it. You can consume it. You can digest it the way you want it. You don't have to read Buddha and his Dhamma like people read some holy book, like read by heart. You don't have to read by heart. He didn't ask us to read by heart. He asked us to consume it, digest it, and to become something new after the digestion of that particular knowledge. So there are so many debates that we can bring into trying to understand this, because this issue that many of us have raised, whether some of the contemporary writers writing about Baba Sahib really have the capacity to produce a knowledge that, as we said, that does not seem arrogant, that does not make claims about truth, that does not distort the historical reality, and so on and so forth, is the question that some of us have posed. Now, one of the arguments we had made that day was very clear that we have to be careful. The dominant subjectivity, the subjectivity of the dominant, can the dominant subject ever produce an objective history? Okay, is the question. Now, it need not be any particular group, but anyway, can the dominant, who claims to be operating from the imperial I location, ever produce an objective reality at all? Especially if that particular dominant subject does not include the complex subjectivity of the dominator. So, can a dominant subject produce objective history by negating the subjectivity of the dominator in the production of, let's say, historical knowledge? Is the question that we're asking. Now, for us, it is very clear that is not possible. It's not possible because of one simple point. There are many points. One of the points is it's not possible because they fail to understand this thing called contextualization. The methodological debate is about contextualization. And what is that debate? If the dominant subject cannot accommodate the subjectivity of the dominator, in other words, they cannot accommodate the context, because here the context equals the subjectivity of the dominator. So if the dominant subject cannot accommodate the context in the analysis and the production of historical knowledge, that is nothing objective at all in that knowledge produced. There's no objective knowledge. It's an interpretation of it. And not only interpretation, if you ask me from our location and perspective, it's a biased location. It's not only bias in terms of methodological bias, it is colonial bias. And what is the difference between methodological bias and colonial bias? Methodological bias, we can still debate. How did you approach? How did you analyze? How did you do it? Which way you do it? But colonial bias is that I am objective. You cannot even question me. The reason of debate and dialogue with them doesn't even arise. So, in that particular sense, the first point that has to be taken into consideration is this context. This context is very important. Now, what is a context? What is a context? The first thing about a context that is important to understand is every context is dynamic. A context is a dynamic confluence of time, space, place, and person. The first point of a context. It's a dynamic confluence of time, of place, of space, of person coming together constantly, in a dynamic relationship with each other. The second thing about a context is it is always fluid, very fluid and interacting. It's not fixed. You don't get a fixed static context. This context is constantly interacting. From the whole morning, you are somewhere else in a different kind of a reality. Now you come to the Sangha, there is a fluidity. Now again, there's an interacting of a different kind. Then our ways of thinking changes, our way of being changes, our thought process change, constantly changing, interacting with new things that are happening around you, and constantly fluid. Third point, the context is organic and somewhat structured. By organic, I mean that this context is grounded in whatever reality you're operating in. Right now, the organic context is the Sangha. And in this Sangha, there is some kind of a structure that emerges, whether we like it or not, it is there. So this context is organic and structured. It is not from external reality imposed on you. It's actually born out of your experience, born out of your organic experience, born out of the own organic experience that then creates a structure of a particular kind. Fourth thing, this context is experience in the here and now. This experience in the here and now is very important. Okay? Because of the dynamic nature of context, we experience it here and now. The minute next moment has begun, here and now. Next moment has begun, here and now. It's like a river flowing. You cannot have one experience, hold it for 5 minutes and then hope that some new experience will come. No, it is a constant flow. Okay? But it is experienced only in the here and now. The fifth thing, context is historically embedded. There is no context out of history. It is historically embedded and containing within itself an embodied epistemology. Let me say this again. A context is historically embedded and containing within itself an embedded epistemology. Every context produces its own epistemology. Every context arises a particular epistemology. Now, these points are important because to understand subjectivity, to understand the subjectivity of the dominated, you have to first understand what is this subjectivity, what is the structure of that subjectivity, what are the dynamic structure of this subjectivity, what are the elements of this subjectivity. And if subjectivity here is a feeling, an affect, an experience of the internal self around the notion of the context, then some of these points have to be considered. Okay. So as I said, the first point is that a context is think about like this. Don't think about reality as static, like fixed in time. Why I'm saying this is important, because the dominant perspective tend to look at reality like that. It looks at Baba Sahib fixed in time. It looks at the Dalit community fixed in time. And they come and extract information from that particular reality and they frame that as though it's a universal truth. Failing to realize that that particular thing that they think is just fixed in time as a data actually is a dynamic confluence of so many realities happening at a particular point in time. Constantly changing, fluid and interacting, organic and structured, experience in the here and now, historically embedded, at the same time producing its own embedded epistemology. By epistemology, I'm referring to the knowledge framework. Okay. So coming back to the point, a learner who is actually a learner, doesn't matter where the learner comes, either from a dominant mainstream or from the dominated, but a learner has a different way to approach reality. But a teacher has only one way to approach reality. For a teacher, the world is simply a thing. And if you can objectify the thing, you can actually extract so-called data from that thing in order to produce an objective, unbiased, universal knowledge. For a learner, they come here to look and understand the reality. They come here to understand the dynamicity of the reality. And in this, one thing happens to the learner, critical to the methodological process. It's called sensitivity. They become sensitive to the reality because now they begin to understand the reality. They have not come here to objectify the reality in order to produce and extract knowledge or information from that reality. They have come to be part of the reality. Because a learner is always open. It doesn't matter who it is. Anybody can be a teacher in this world. Actually, life itself is a great teacher. And they're able to let go of that imperial I concept, which is the bane of the colonial activists, of the colonial academic. And this is what we have to be very careful about. Now, the second point to be understood is that every context embodies an epistemology. This is a very important point to be made. Okay. So some of these people who are writing about Baba's, if they really are learners, they will come to learn our epistemology. They will not come to lecture us from a location of a dominant epistemology. This is the problem. A real learner, and there are many. I like Galo, where some of these people, I can name them. Okay. They have come here not to lecture, they have come to learn. And part of the learning process is the production of a very different knowledge. That's why they are unique. The reason that Gail is unique in the way she has engaged with the reality is simply because of this point. Because she embodied that epistemology, and from that location, she began to write about reality. Okay. So every context embodies an epistemology. Now the question is, what is a context epistemology? What do you mean by a context epistemology? A context epistemology that propels the production of knowledge, okay, also the ways in which knowledge is structured, the usefulness of that knowledge, the necessity of that knowledge, okay, the rules of validity or non-validity of that knowledge, and how its constitutive elements come to know and experience social realities. And epistemology embodies all of this. It embodies dynamicity, it embodies structure, it embodies the conception of knowledge of valid and non-valid. It embodies life experience of people. It embodies a way of interpreting the reality. It embodies what you would understand called the very structure of knowledge itself. It embodies this whole idea we call experience. It embodies the whole idea of interpretation based on experience, and so on and so forth. So context epistemology is very different. And to me personally, I have also tried to understand this. How can one actually embody the context epistemology of the context? I'm not concerned about the information about the context. I'm not concerned about the kind of even the history of that context. I'm concerned about the epistemology of that context. And once one becomes concerned about the epistemology, then, as I said, this one single thing that comes, which is, as is pointed out just now, sensitivity to the way you produce knowledge comes into. And what does sensitivity means? What knowledge are you producing? Is that knowledge sensitive to the reality? And sensitive means, will it hurt that reality? Okay. Will it put that reality in trouble? Will it distort that reality? Will it put you in a position in which, first of all, you are dominated? Now you become again distorted to the extent where you get, there's a burden of domination on you, And in all of this, the dominant subject who is writing about it reclaims the dominant position. Okay. Remember, this whole project has to be understood properly. When the dominant subject writes about the subjectivity and the contextual experience of the dominated, what you see is the text about the dominated, but what you don't see is the reclamation of power of the dominant over the dominated. This is something that you have to be very careful about. We have to be very careful. I do not know, I cannot, there's no need for me to mention about the thinkers that we're speaking about. But if you look properly at the process, it seems as though they have written, becoming Ambedkar. But in writing about becoming Ambedkar, in which they have actually objectified the subjective reality of the dominated, they have reclaimed their own dominant position as the imperial I that can write about and teach others what it is all about. So this game is a very complex game, and one has to understand the nitty-gritty of this game. Okay, so the third point, which I think is important to understand the context, is that this context requires something called contextualization. Now we are entering methodology. Okay, defining context doesn't mean that it's a methodology. It's a concept that we are using. It's like you're using Dalit is like a concept that we're using to understand 2,000 years of history. Context is a concept to understand the methodology of the dominant and the methodology of the dominated. So now we are entering the methodological realm, which is called contextualization. Okay, so context is the heuristic device or the concept that we are trying to understand, but now we are engaging in contextualization. Now, the act of contextualization requires a lot of effort of thinking. I'll tell you, because it's contextualization. The first thing that contextualization demands is humility, a learner's attitude. Okay, a person who is respectful of dialogue, a person who's open to things, not a closed system, but an open system, always open to. Okay, and none of that. It requires not only humility; it requires you to have the ability and the understanding when to keep your mouth quiet, shut, and when to speak, and even how to behave with people. Contextualization is not this typical. It requires a totality in a behavioral change of a person. You'll see many contextualists. I've seen many beautiful contextualists. I can mention one person here, Professor T.K. Oman, a very good contextualist. Okay, some of us who know Professor Oman, very excellent in contextualists. Now, when I made a point that day that Baba Sahib was a contextualist par excellence, I'm simply making a point that Baba Sahib learned many, many knowledges across the world. He was not only learning one particular knowledge, he was open to all types of knowledge. But whenever he began to think, write, and produce knowledge, it is always the context from where all his knowledges arise. Okay, I have read many types of knowledges and knowledges across the world, ecologies of knowledges that are available across the world, and but I always attempt, even though I know of many other framework that exists in the realms of knowledge, I always attempt to see that I write from the organic context and producing from this organic context a theory or a knowledge in that particular sense. Now, this movement from understanding the context and then entering contextualization is where the real game is all about. And it is here, I think, that we must challenge some of these current authors right now, that they do not have. You do not have this ability for contextualization. Okay? You have come, you have seen the context, you objectified the context, you have written about the context, you have organized the context from your particular location of particular worldview, and you think you have done a great favor by doing that. That is called extractivism. It's got nothing to do with production of knowledge. And this is called colonial extractivism, the extractivism of the imperial eye. It's got nothing to do with the production of knowledge. A real knowledge about the dominated has to be sensitive, it has to be safe, it has to be born from the experience, it has to be contextual or contextualization. Now, the act of contextualization is an effort that demands engagement, living in that reality, deconstructing oneself and deconstructing the reality, delineating boundaries that exist and become awake to these delineation of boundary processes, unraveling the reality rather than so-called writing about the reality, unraveling oneself in that particular context of that reality. Not only that, reassembling oneself if need be. Reassembling oneself if need be in the light of that understanding that arises from that context. So contextualization demands multiple processes. The unraveling, the deconstruction process, a very serious engagement with that particular reality. The awakening to these boundaries that delineates you from the other. Reassembling all of these so-called things that you experience in the context. It requires a lot of that. Now, not only that, it requires also to understand what are the realities that are intersecting. For someone who's a contextualist, there is nothing called an object of inquiry. There is instead lines and multiple lines of inquiry. There is nothing called an object, or someone has come from America or someone has come from Rome, and they're sitting now and collecting data about Baba Sahib, and they're writing biographies of Baba Sahib, and this is the perfect truth because their interpretation is so detailed, their data is so detailed, their archival work is so detailed, no one now can challenge them because they are now the authorities. What kind of project is this? What kind of a project is this? My question to them would have been, how much has you engaging with this reality changed you? Forget about changing others else. Your claim to power is just a political act. It's got nothing to do with knowledge. I'm questioning you now, how much it has changed you. Why do you think that you only are here to change us? Because you're the imperial I. You cannot be changed. You are perfect. You are objective. You are unbiased. So, so the question now we have to think properly in contextualization is that contextualization is not like that. Contextualization demands you all of these processes to take place simultaneously. Now, for these people, there is object of inquiry. We are objects of their inquiry. But for a contextualist, reality is too dynamic to objectify. There's so many lines of inquiry. I can argue. You have written about this. Did you check the gender point of view? Did you check this particular point of view? Did you check the history of the Buddhist point of view? Did you check the Shramanic line of inquiry? Did you check the tribal line of inquiry? Did you check the Maharashtra line of inquiry? Do you know all of that for you to objectify reality as though it's a static, fixed entity? There's so many lines just between Nagpur and Akola and Mumbai. There's so many lines of inquiry. What are you telling me? You're writing the history about Maharashtra. So the question now is that in the contextualization, there are multiple lines of inquiry. And the inquiry is only one who unravels these lines of inquiry and speaks about it in a manner that is actually so called not only consumable by the other, but not claimed to be fact, but claimed to be propositions about reality. One of the most beautiful things about Baba Sahib that I've learned is that rarely Baba Sahib will assert. Instead, he will put a proposition. Now, assertion here is not the English word assertion. Assertion means the methodological assertion. That is, I'm asserting a fact. Like if I read Untouchables, who are they and how they became to be, he says, this is my proposition, and I'm willing and open to anybody to come and challenge me. He didn't say that this is my, it's a fact, you know. So he's still open to learning. Come now, let us debate. If you think that you have a better proposition, then let's have a discussion. Like that. That's why I'm saying contextualist par excellence. Always open to new knowledges, but putting such an argument and based on such analysis and accommodating so multiple lines of inquiry, nothing objectified, just simply articulating these lines of inquiry. You know? So contextualization, it has to be understood on those lines. It's not this imperial project of objectification. It is actually a decolonial project of the unraveling of lines of inquiry, always open as propositions rather than as assertions. Now, contextualization engages with multiplicity. We have to understand properly what is multiplicity. What is this multiplicity of reality? Because multiplicity also brings into the analysis something called complexities. Reality for a contextualist is always complex because of the multiple nature of that reality. And because of this complexity, always willing to be open to learn new things. I can never claim through objectification that I have understood. Okay? Because in a very unilinear, objectified reality as a thing, then I can claim that I know. How can you claim to be an expert in a reality that's so complex and so multiple at the same time? Have you captured everything, the whole point of view for you to claim that you know everything? You know, a contextualist will only say, this is my particular line. I'm willing to, and open to hear other lines of inquiry because of the complex and multiple nature of reality. Why? Because I can never, as a human being, even if I try, to understand all of reality. Not possible. It's not all of reality. I can never make a claim of that particular kind. So I don't know whether I have done some justice to try to. This requires we have to sit properly because you have to really think deep. Okay, we cannot just sit like this and then talk about context. Because you have to go into the minute processes into how exactly it happens, what takes place, what it shapes up to be, because these are methodological processes now. So that is where I think one has to kind of take a look a little bit. So contextualization, a contextual, the point that I made about Baba Sahib being a contextualist par excellence has to be understood in the totality of this particular way of approaching knowledge. Okay, approaching knowledge. And the only thing that I want to say at the end here is to make this point that knowledge produced by a contextualist is always emancipatory, is always healing, it's always dialogical. because there's a humility in that knowledge. Okay, but a knowledge produced from this universalist point of view is always colonial, always imperial, always egoistic, always about power. It's got nothing to do with healing. It's got nothing to do with emancipation. It's got nothing to do with freedom. It's got nothing to do nothing like that, because it is a political project. It's not a truth-seeking project. It's not an emancipatory project. Okay, so if you read Baba Sahib, when we read Baba Sahib, even a person like me who read Baba Sahib, coming from a reality that is so different, I feel emancipated. I feel liberated. I feel healed. Why is that so? How did that happen? It's not because I know him, I don't know him, or I can attach with that idea that he produced or not, or that I can understand the knowledge he produced or not. No. You can, there is an intellectual taste that arises from the kind of writing that simply makes you feel liberated, makes you feel healed, makes you feel humane, makes you feel sensitive, make you grounded, make you look at the world differently, make you look at the structures of oppression differently, unravel these structures of oppression and exclusion, identifies the force of exclusion, tells us how do we behave. That's how emancipation takes place. But on a very negative note, when I read the writings of the colonial universalists, I feel subjugated. It's like I feel, what is happening? What are they writing? I feel as though there is a power structure that is now trying to impose on me something else, which I I don't connect with. And I can clearly see that it's a particular speaker from an imperial location talking about reality. It's not someone who's come to join our reality, and from that organic experience of joining the reality, begin to articulate. And when you articulate sensitive, see that you don't put people in trouble, see that you don't distort their reality, so see that you don't distort their struggle, see that you don't throw their struggle all over the place. What kind of a knowledge project in which the only vision of that knowledge project is to distort the reality and the history of the oppressed people? What kind of a knowledge project is that? So we have to be, there are so many dynamics to this process. Probably next time we can come again and reflect a bit more about this context. I did not think, because today we're just immediately reflecting that. So I did not think properly. So let me just put the point. When one of you raised about subjectivity, I didn't talk about subjectivity per se as the experience of feelings, of thought and emotions inside the body. Okay. And in Buddhism, we say even sensations. Subjectivity in Buddhism is very deep. Subjectivity in the Western European epistemological framework talks about thought process and feelings, but in Buddhism it goes very deep. We call it the khandas. It goes very deep till the level of the sensation, because subjectivity is actually, from Buddhist point of view, experience at the level of the sensation. Okay, so I didn't go into that particular realm. I just look at subjectivity as something born out of context. And I kind of relate subjectivity to the context. And then I try to define what the context is. The point about the ability to see context as constantly dynamic. The dynamic confluence of time, place, space, person, every constantly moving. In Buddhism, we have a beautiful words: rising and passing away, rising and peaking and passing away, fluid and interacting, organic and structured, experience in the here and now, historically embedded, producing its own epistemological reality, its own way of conceiving knowledge. Maharashtra is such a beautiful case for that. I mean, some of my students who are working in these areas are looking, but unfortunately, they're not going to this depth. When we talk about the Akola model, how the Akola model produces its own epistemology, the Nagpur model, how it produces its own epistemology, the Mumbai model, how it produces its own epistemology, how these epistemologies are interacting, what are the tensions among these epistemologies, how they actually interpret reality. We come from one state called Maharashtra. Probably all of us, experience that reality. But look at how epistemology operates. And probably in Akola also, probably West Akola will have a different one. East Akola will have a different one, like that. So this is exactly what a context is all about.